Sadly, we have a lot of late injury news that we are going to have to talk about in this video, but I'm not going to waste your time with tier one outside of saying that Bijan Robinson was limited on Thursday with the shoulder injury. That will be something to monitor for the Friday practice. If he does miss, Tyler Algier is going to be a must-start guy. Not ranking Algier, though, because I'm expecting that Bijan will play. Nico Collins also is limited with the hamstring on Thursday. This will also be something that's very important to monitor for the Friday and Saturday updates. Of course, I'll be updating my rankings on flockfantasy.com every single day until we get NFL kickoff. So there, we will let you know what's up, if you should start Algier or not. Tier 2, don't want to waste your time here either. Every single player will be a start. Really, the first time that we need to be talking about anybody will be Tier 3. Devon Achane leading us off here. Now, yes, everybody in the comment section was irate with me last week for quote-unquote ranking Devon Achane too low. I will stand by what we said last week. I'll reiterate, he's a Tier 3 player for me right now in the flex spots. Because while, yes, he is a phenomenal talent, it does not matter. If you look at Tyreek, if you look at Achane, if you look at Jalen Waddle, the expectations should be significantly lowered with this being one of the worst offenses in the NFL with no Tua. Now, with this being said, what's going to be very important to watch here for Achane is if Raheem Mostert will play this week, because honestly, if Mostert is good to go, I may move Achane a little bit lower in these rankings, even below somebody like Jonathan Taylor. Obviously, Taylor has been phenomenal. Over the past 2 weeks, he's had over 100 rushing yards each game. But this week in particular, it is a really tough matchup going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers so far this season have had a top 3 rush defense, and they've been extremely successful in shutting down opposing running back ones, regardless of if that's J.K. Dobbins, Bijan Robinson. They limit these guys. And with JT, the issue is he doesn't have the usage as a receiver to maybe give him that floor, even if it's a tough matchup. Similar to what we saw with Bijan Robinson in week 1. Bijan got there against the Steelers, but the reason was because what he was able to do as a receiver, not as a rusher. Now, our next running back is going to be James Cook. If you're looking at James Cook, the back-to-back weeks of limited carries has not mattered because the man has scored 4 touchdowns over the past 2 weeks. You're looking at 3 straight weeks of double-digit fantasy points. He is right now averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. Going up against the Baltimore Ravens, definitely a tough matchup. However, you actually have the lowest implied team total for the Buffalo Bills, at least for what they've had all year, only at 22.5 points. Derrick Henry will be our next running back here. If you're looking at Derrick Henry coming off a monstrous game against the Dallas Cowboys, where we had the Baltimore Ravens just completely blow the Cowboys out. I know it looked like a game at the end. It really wasn't. So we ended up getting to see 25 rush attempts for Derrick Henry. And in that kind of environment, yes, he's going to drop 30 points in fantasy. Now, the issue is going up against the Buffalo Bills this week. Do we expect that that is going to be the case? Probably not. While the Ravens are favored in this game, they're only favored by 1.5. And similar to what we were saying with Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry doesn't have the receiving role to save him when it is a tough matchup and the game environment's not in his favor. Josh Jacobs will be our next back. I actually think Jacobs is one of the best buy low candidates you can have in fantasy football right now. Emmanuel Wilson this past week, phenomenal performance, right? Emmanuel Wilson this past week was up there with the best game that Jacobs has had all year if you're just looking at fantasy point totals. But that's because he had a receiving touchdown, and that's not necessarily based off of volume. If you're looking at Jacobs going into the future, this is a running back that only has to share touches with Emmanuel Wilson. You have no A.J. Dillon. You have no Marshawn Lloyd, both on the IR. Now with Jordan Love coming back in, this should be a much better offense going into the future. Then looking at Brandon Ayuk, sadly, we had to move Ayuk down a little bit from where he was in the wide receiver rankings. The reason being is both Deebo Samuel and George Kittle were at practice on Thursday. So obviously, if Deebo and or Kittle would be good to go, the expectations for Ayuk dramatically decline. But if you have no Deebo or Kittle, Ayuk is a receiver coming off of a 10-target performance. It's going to pay $120 million. And at the same time, this is an offense that should be very good against the New England Patriots. They currently have an implied team total of about 25 points. So I think Ayuk is somebody that you have to start. I know a lot of people screaming at us going, Christian Gonzalez. Guys, I interviewed Christian Gonzalez at the draft. I'm rooting for him more than anybody else. But did he shut down Garrett Wilson last week? No. Did he shut down DK Metcalf in week 2? No. Did he shut down Jamar Chase in week 1? No, he did not. Okay, so Christian Gonzalez isn't as scary as everybody's making him out to be. I actually went through and made the biggest underdog pick'em slip of my entire life. If you are new to Underdog, for the love of God, do not be doing anything like this. But I actually submitted a pick 'em slip, $1,000 entry for about $8,800. What we need is Ayuk to score a touchdown, Jaden Reed to have more than 47.5 receiving yards, Rachaad White to have more than 37.5 rushing yards. Really hoping that hits. So that's what we're rooting for this week. And of course, if you wanted to check out any of those pick'ems over on Underdog Fantasy, you can find that link in the description or the comment section. And if you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you will get a free Patrick Mahomes pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for the Sunday game. You will get a free Lamar Jackson pick, more than less than half a total yard for the Sunday game on top of that. And you'll be getting a free team review in a live stream through flockfantasy.com. Just make sure you go with the link in the comment section and code FLOCK. But let's go over to our next player, and this will be Tyreek Hill. Now, obviously, Tyreek for back-to-back weeks now has been garbage. Tyreek back-to-back weeks has had 7 or fewer fantasy points. But taking a step backwards, we have to remember that Tyreek is a wide receiver that you only need one play from. One big, long receiving touchdown. He has that in his range of outcomes, regardless of who the quarterback is. I still think that he's a must-start guy, even if, obviously, our expectations are dramatically lower with no Tua. I mean, hell, if we had Tua, he would be probably number 2 in these rankings for me. Now, dropping down to our next tier, Stefon Diggs will be somebody that is very difficult to rank right now because as it looks today, it looks like you will have no Tank Dell for this game. And it looks like Nico Collins potentially is at risk as well with his hamstring. So with the context of that, Stefon Diggs may just be an absolute target hog going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars defense that hasn't been able to stop anybody. And Diggs is coming off a performance with 12 targets, 10 receptions for 94 receiving yards. So Stefon Diggs honestly may go even higher than this if Nico Collins were to miss this next week. Now, Brian Robinson, I'm ranking here under the assumption that Austin Eckler is going to miss. If Austin Eckler does play, we are moving Brian Robinson down dramatically. In the game that Austin Eckler was taken out of early, we saw a season high of 76% of the snaps for Brian Robinson here. Going up against Arizona, I think it's going to be a much better matchup than it was last week. So y'all kind of screamed at me last week that we were too low on Brian Robinson. Scream at me this week that we're too high on him. But if Eckler misses, the man's going to have the receiving role as well, and he'll crush. And Najee Harris is going to crush as well with no Jalen Warren. I mean, Najee Harris is a running back that has averaged about 18.5 carries per game through the first 3 weeks. The thing is, when you had the Jalen Warren absence for the second half of last game, you actually saw 5 targets for Najee in this backfield. Now, this is also going to be a very strong matchup going up against the Indianapolis Colts. So personally, I think that Najee is honestly a must-start player here with no Warren. Now, Devontae Adams will be your next guy. Devontae Adams popped up on the injury report with a hamstring. And on top of this, with Adams, he's a very tough matchup going up against the Cleveland Browns. Right now, you have an implied team total of only 18 points here for this Las Vegas Raiders offense. But this will be a player that you really need to monitor what's going to happen on Friday and Saturday with his availability. David Montgomery will be our next player. Montgomery has absolutely crushed. And y'all know I was team Gibbs this offseason. I was drafting Gibbs at a higher price than we could have gotten Montgomery at. And Montgomery's been phenomenal. Now, with that being said, David Montgomery's also scored a touchdown in every single game so far this season. Gibbs has shown at the same time that he is going to be used at the goal line. While Montgomery has had the target volume in this offense, I don't necessarily know if that's going to be super easy to project going into the future. Where we go back 2 weeks ago, David Montgomery had the 4-target game and a game where Jared Goff had over 50 pass attempts. David Montgomery has been averaging about 45% of the snaps in this Detroit Lions offense. Now, that being said, it's one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. It's one of the best offenses in the NFL. So this is the only team, of course, that you can start both of their top running backs with extreme confidence. Now, our next guy will be Aaron Jones. Looking at Aaron Jones, I need to take an L here as well. I was worried about Jones coming into this season, but this Vikings offense has been so much better than we were expecting it to. While Aaron Jones is definitely still operating that committee with Ty Chandler, where he's averaging about 58% of the snaps so far for Minnesota, it hasn't stopped him at all from averaging about 15 touches per game. I mean, just carries per game. Then you go ahead and you add on the fact that he's also seeing 4 to 5 targets a game out of this backfield. He's a true 3-down back that has shown the ability to have the touchdown upside, specifically because this offense is a lot better than we were expecting it to be this season. Then our next two guys back to back here will be Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. Obviously, it's very difficult not to have Chris Godwin as the wide receiver one here, where Godwin getting used in the slot has been great this season. However, if we are looking at the touchdown rate right now for Chris Godwin has a total of 3 touchdowns off of 25 targets. This is a significantly higher touchdown rate than we have ever seen for Godwin throughout his NFL career. What this probably means is I don't think we can pencil him to score a touchdown every single week going into the future. We're probably going to have some Mike Evans games going forward, but obviously Godwin has been phenomenal. I don't want to take anything away from him. Now, going over to our next receiver, we are going to be looking at Mr. 4 targets a game, though 5 targets a game, whatever it is, Chris Olave. Olave this past week had the best game of his season, with the context of it was a close contest going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. This week, going up against the Atlanta Falcons, if you are looking at Las Vegas sportsbooks, you actually have Atlanta favored by about 1 point to 1.5 points in this game. And in that context, I think we actually see a little bit more of the Chris Olave over Rashid Shaheed, similar to what we had this past week in Philly. I mean, you just had 6 receptions for 86 receiving yards and the receiving touchdown, and Olave has been able to separate phenomenally. Now, going over to our next player, Zach Moss was a buy low candidate for us last week. He was a must-start guy for us last week, and I stand by, he's probably a buy low candidate and a must-start player yet again. The man is averaging over 75% of the snaps currently in the Cincinnati Bengals offense. He is currently sitting here with a total of 11 targets this season through the first 3 weeks. He is averaging over 10 carries per game. So you're telling me we are getting about 75% of the snaps in what projects out to be one of the best offenses in the NFL in a game where they are favored by about 4.5 points over the Carolina Panthers. It's a phenomenal game environment. Should be a very high-scoring offense with an applied team total of 26 points. And Zach Moss has the exact kind of role that you would be looking for. Now, going over to our next guy, Kenneth Walker is a tough player to rank. I am making this ranking under the assumption that Kenneth Walker will be good to go on Monday. Of course, I'll be updating on the live stream every single night, and I'll be updating the rankings over on flogfantasy.com every single day. The updates that we have with Kenneth Walker, specifically regarding his availability for the Monday night contest. And I will say, it is a very tough matchup for Kenneth Walker going up against the Lions. I made a massive mistake of ranking James Conner way too high last week. And the reason for that is I underestimated how good this Lions rush defense has been. I mean, right now they're sitting probably with the most impressive rush defense of the entire NFL so far this season. So this may end up being a little bit more of a pass happy approach for the Seattle Seahawks, and that would lead us right into our next guy with DK Metcalf, where if you are looking at Metcalf, he's at 24 targets so far this season. Obviously, we've been in a very fortunate position to have the long receiving touchdown kind of saving the day last week, where he only had a total of 4 receptions, but when you get that long receiving touchdown, it just simply does not matter. Metcalf obviously has cemented himself as the wide receiver one here. I will be a little bit concerned given the fact that Lockett's still seeing targets, and obviously JSN is playing a career high in snaps. Now, going over to DJ Moore is playing pretty damn close to 100% of the snaps for the Chicago Bears right now. And considering the fact that you are getting like 50 plus pass attempts for Caleb Williams this past week, it's an insane mark. I mean, right now you're actually sitting with about 9.5 targets per game for DJ Moore through the first 3 weeks. Now, I will say, 1, obviously the touchdown upside hasn't been here. And 2, you're actually getting Keenan Allen added back in. So if Keenan Allen is getting added back into this offense, despite this being a great matchup going up against the Los Angeles Rams, we should expect maybe the target share comes down just a bit here for DJ Moore. Now, going over to our next receiver, I think Drake London has been and remains a must-start wide receiver in fantasy. I do want to reiterate our stance on London and Bijan because I know some people have said that we're ranking these guys too high. If you are looking at the Atlanta Falcons offense, while yes, they have struggled, you need to look at the matchups that they have played in. They have played against the Steelers, they have played against the Eagles, and they have played against the Chiefs. This hasn't exactly been a cakewalk. Going into the future, I do believe that Drake London and Bijan Robinson will both have much better matchups than what they've dealt with so far. And honestly, I am much more excited to start them. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at Travis Etienne. With Etienne, the issue has been this has just been a garbage offense. I mean, the volume is there, the exact workload you were looking for, where Etienne has had 13 targets this season, Travis Etienne is also averaging 12 rushing attempts per game. So if you're sitting here, you're getting 16, 17 opportunities per game for Travis Etienne, and he's giving you double-digit fantasy points every single week. The issue is we haven't seen the big play be there. This offense just has been very, very bad. And it's a game against the Houston Texans where right now you only have a 19.5-point implied team total. So sportsbooks are telling us that it's going to be yet again another low-scoring week for this Jacksonville Jaguars offense. Now, our next player will be Garrett Wilson. If you are looking at Garrett Wilson, he is the locked and loaded wide receiver 1 for Aaron Rodgers. He's had 26 targets through the first 3 weeks, playing pretty much every snap, running every single route. It's a very concentrated offense as well. He's had double-digit points every single game, so he's given you a decent floor. The issue is this week going up against the Denver Broncos. This is a defensive back matchup that just locked down Mike Evans, that has locked down every wide receiver 1 he has played against so far this season. I think if you look at the underdog pick'em for Garrett Wilson this week, he's only higher or lower, like 55.5 total receiving yards last I checked. So it is tough to play Garrett Wilson because of this matchup. But if you go over to flockfantasy.com and look at my rest of season rankings, you will see that I have Garrett Wilson ranked significantly higher rest of season than this. But this is a very tough matchup in particular. Now, Deontay Johnson will be our next wide receiver. With Deontay going up against a Cincinnati Bengals defense that just allowed Jaden Daniels to look like the best quarterback in the NFL. You actually have a 21.5-point implied team total here for this Carolina Panthers offense. So right now, sportsbooks are telling us that this Panthers game against the Raiders isn't a fluke. The Panthers all of a sudden are actually a team that you could project for reasonable volume. Now, with that being said, Deontay Johnson did miss practice on Thursday. He's saying that he's going to be playing on Sunday. I think that we should take him at his word. And in that instance, with no Adam Thielen, while yes, through the first 3 weeks, we said Deontay Johnson was a player that you needed on your bench. Honestly, at this point, I think that we can say, okay, well, I am going to reverse that stance. No Adam Thielen, much better quarterback play. Decent matchup here. I think Deontay is definitely someone you can be excited about if he plays. Now, Rachaad White will be our next guy here at 38. If we are looking at Rachaad White, this is a running back that has played over 70% of the snaps for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers each and every week. Now, the issue with this is Rachaad White has been one of the least efficient running backs in the entire NFL. Where against Washington, where everybody can score points, he averages 2.07 yards per carry. Against Detroit, 1.8. Against Denver, 2.8. Now, the receiving volume has been there, but I think the saving grace with Rachaad White this week is Bucky Irving did miss practice on Thursday. It seems like this Bucky Irving injury is actually lingering a little bit longer than people expected. Now, with that being said, Bucky Irving did say that he is going to be playing this weekend, but you potentially see Bucky at a limited role in comparison to what we would expect for the young ascending rookie talent, which is why, like I said, in that pick'em that I made on Underdog, I actually did take Rachaad White to have more than 33.5 rushing yards. Now, going over to Juwan Jennings, there's a massive, massive asterisk on this ranking. This is going to be one of the most important rankings to monitor on the site going up until Sunday, because as it stands right now, we do not know the availability of Deebo Samuel, George Kittle. If both Deebo Samuel and George Kittle are out, obviously Juwan Jennings is a must-start player as a receiver that we saw this past week have the best game of any wide receiver in fantasy this season with 46.5 points. Now, if we were to get possibly a healthy Deebo Samuel, if we were to possibly get a healthy George Kittle, and they are in this game, I still expect that Brandon Ayuk is the wide receiver 1 ahead of Juwan Jennings. I think there are probably 120 million reasons for that, but he would probably be like the third, fourth option and definitely a whole lot less exciting. Now, Cam Akers is another player to put a massive asterisk on. And I know, yes, I told you to start Cam Akers last week. And yes, he only scored 10 fantasy points. And honestly, we got lucky for those 10 points because he scored the receiving touchdown. This next week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, I do believe it's going to be a much better matchup for him. This is a game that got completely out of hand against the Minnesota Vikings, where the Minnesota Vikings defense completely shut down this Texans offense. Where right now, if we're looking at the implied team total that Houston has, they're supposed to score 25, 26 points in this game. And if that will be the case going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, where they are about 5, 6, 7 point favorites, we should expect that we actually get some rushing attempts for Houston in the second half, unlike what we saw this past week where they had abandoned and they just had to throw it. So I am okay still going back to the well with Akers. I am okay going back to the well with Ramondre Stevenson. These are both running backs that I am starting in the Flock League this week. With Ramondre Stevenson, last week it was a complete debacle. Not only was it a debacle, but we all got to watch it. It was a primetime game. It was brutal. It was ruined my week, legitimately. What's funny with Ramondre is he's had a fumble in every single game so far this season. He's only lost one, but he's had a fumble in every game. Looking at the Jets' performance, you see the ultimate floor of an offense that consistently projects to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL from a week-to-week perspective. This is a game against the San Francisco 49ers that you actually only have an implied team total of about 14.5 points for the New England Patriots, where we should assume that Ramondre Stevenson has the vast majority of the work, but doesn't have a ton of raw upside. Now, Chuba Hubbard will be our next running back. If you are looking at Chuba Hubbard, I think he's a very exciting name where we saw the absolute blow up this past week, both with the involvement as a receiver as well as the involvement as a rusher, where he had 26 total touches. It was a game where the Panthers just completely blew out the Raiders. However, in this contest going up against the Cincinnati Bengals, I would expect that this is actually a game where the Panthers are going to be trailing. And at the same time, Miles Sanders is still seeing work. You actually have not had a game yet this season where Chuba Hubbard has cracked 60% of the snaps in this backfield. Tony Pollard will be our next guy here. If we are looking at Tony Pollard, he is hovering right around 60% of the snaps. The issue is this is just actually supposed to be a much worse offense than what you have with the projections in Carolina. The Tennessee Titans, we knew that they were projected to be a bottom 5 offense coming into the NFL this season. A lot of people said we were wrong with that, but I just said, look at the sports books, and it looks like the sports books are right. Go figure. But as it stands right now, I think that Pollard is a fine committee back where Tajay Spears isn't taking as much of a role as a receiver as I was initially concerned with Tony Pollard. Now, our next guy will be Terry McLaurin. Obviously, he looked great this past week. He looked like he was playing with the best quarterback of his entire NFL career. But still, with that being said, I know it was a primetime game. I know we all watched it and it was very exciting. But Terry McLaurin is a wide receiver so far this season with less than 140 receiving yards. McLaurin is not averaging 50 receiving yards per game. Terry McLaurin is sitting here with 18 targets, averaging 6 targets per contest. But the issue is, well, yes, we see the deep ball from Jaden Daniels this past week. That has not been a consistent factor in this offense for the Washington Commanders yet this season. So I do want to be a little hesitant with Terry McLaurin. I will say I actually just traded Terry McLaurin to Sal Vetri in the Flock League. I gave up Terry McLaurin, Tajay Spears, and got back Anthony Richardson, Ladd McConkey, and 18 fab dollars. I was streaming quarterback and really needed someone, and Sal had Josh Allen. I'm going over to our next guy. We are looking at Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper, massive blow up this past week. However, if you're looking at what you have currently with sportsbooks, they are projecting out this yet again to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL with only a 19.5 point implied team total. Deshaun Watson currently looks like one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the NFL, especially now that Bryce Young has been benched. So the volume will be consistent, but the quarterback play will be bad. Now going over to Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers week 1, Zay Flowers week 2. Great work. You had double-digit targets through the first 2 weeks. With that being said, obviously the volume fell dramatically in week 3, but that was a game where I believe Lamar Jackson had 12 completions. So obviously we're not expecting that Zay Flowers is going to exactly cook. The plan for this Baltimore Ravens offense is that they can to run the ball. And obviously Flowers looks like the wide receiver 1 here, and Andrews likely have been horrendous over the past few weeks. But I do still expect the tight end staff some kind of work in this offense. Now going over to T. Higgins, the first week back from the hamstring, plays 90% of the snaps. Very close to having a big game. There were a couple of catches that, were woulda, coulda, shoulda been awesome. But ultimately, Yoshi Vosh is actually the guy that comes away with the touchdowns, is the guy that actually is exciting. I still think that this is going to be one of the best offenses in the NFL here in Cincinnati. You have a 26-point implied team total. I still believe that T. Higgins is the wide receiver 2 in this offense, even if he's been very bad this year. We're off of 1 game. Going over to our next guy, Jayden Reed, one of the best buy low candidates in all of fantasy football right now. If you're looking at Jaden Reed, yes, he doesn't really play in 3 wide receiver sets. Back-to-back weeks where he's only played in about 55% of these snaps for the Green Bay Packers. But frankly, it doesn't matter because when he is on the field, this is the guy that's drawing the targets. If you are looking at the addition of Jordan Love into this offense and no more Malik Willis, the passing volume should go dramatically up. The market share numbers have been great for Jaden Reed so far this year. So obviously he was a must-bench guy over the past 2 weeks with no Jordan Love. But I think he's somebody that you need to start this week now that you have Love back in. Now going over to J.K. Dobbins. Dobbins has back-to-back weeks here with over 15 total opportunities. And with Dobbins, you actually had the departure of Gus Edwards in this backfield this past week, where Dobbins sees a season high is 65% of the snaps for the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, I want to put an asterisk on here as well. Obviously, we had the injuries to both Joe Alt as well as Justin Herbert that we will need to be keeping into consideration when we are playing J.K. Dobbins. If Herbert does not play this game, J.K. Dobbins will be lower in these rankings. George Pickens will be our next guy. I'll reiterate what we see every single week with Pickens. Talented receiver will get the vast majority of the work here in Pittsburgh, but the issue is the passing volume's never there. If you look at the Justin Fields pick him on Underdog this week, he's like higher, lower, 165 passing yards with projections. So yeah, it doesn't really matter. I know maybe he was close to doing something against Denver. Who cares? He had 4.9 fantasy points. I mean, right now he's averaging fewer than 10 fantasy points per game. Going over to Jackson Smith-Njigba, definitely a boom bust option here. But with JSN, we have seen a career high with his snap rate every single week over the past 3, 79% to 83% to 88%, slowly but surely turning into an every week player for the Seattle Seahawks. And at the same time, going up against the Detroit Lions here is actually a game where we should assume that the Lions are going to be winning in the second half. We actually have a considerable amount of passing volume because we know you can't really run the ball against the Lions. So I think this is a sneaky spot to play Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now, going over to Carson Steele, I am making this ranking under the assumption that you are going to have Kareem Hunt active. If Kareem Hunt is not going to play, then at that point, Carson Steele would dramatically go up. At that point, Carson Steele would be guaranteed essentially to see 15 plus touches here and one of the best offenses in the NFL. But if Kareem Hunt does play, I'm probably not really excited to start Steele just because we have no idea what the split's going to be. And then Jerome Ford will be our next back here. Ford actually goes from 44% of the snaps in week 2 against Jacksonville up to 79% of the snaps this past week against the Giants. So it really does seem like, okay, well, if the Browns will be trailing, then Jerome Ford's going to be on the field. That makes sense, right? Ford's the pass catcher. Deonta Foreman is not. However, if the Browns are winning the game like they were against the Jacksonville Jaguars, probably not going to get a lot of Jerome Ford action. This game against the Raiders, you'd have to be concerned that it does seem like the Browns can get to an early lead. Now, Calvin Ridley will be our next receiver. Obviously, with Calvin Ridley, you had about the 25-point contest back in week 2 against the Jets. But with that being said, if you look at the underlying volume, you've only had a total of 8 receptions so far through the first 3 games for Calvin Ridley. He absolutely face plants this past week. Right now, if you are looking at sportsbook projections, you have a 19-point implied team total right now for the Tennessee Titans. So this is supposed to be one of the worst offenses in the entire NFL. So I am very much worried about Ridley. Rome Odunze, obviously, phenomenal blow-up spot this past week. He gives you the 11 targets, 112 receiving yards, and the receiving touchdown. 23 fantasy points in his 3rd NFL game ever. We're going to assume that the rookie continues to improve. We're going to assume that Caleb Williams continues to improve as well. But with that being said, if Keenan Allen does play this week, I think you have to scale back the overall market share numbers that you have for Rome in this offense. While at the same time, we probably aren't going to be getting 50 passing attempts every single week for Caleb Williams here. Now, going over to our next options, we are going to have Jalen Waddle and Jameson Williams back-to-back. As I'm sitting here and looking at the projections in these offenses, I actually think that we potentially want to be flipping Jameson and Waddle. Because if we're looking at this, you have a 17.5-point implied team total for the Miami Dolphins. Actually, I do think this went up a bit. Let me double check here. Yeah, actually, you do have a 19-point implied team total for the Miami Dolphins. Whereas if we're going to be looking at what we have with the Detroit Lions, the Lions every single week project out to be one of the best offenses in the NFL with 25 plus points. I think you probably have the safer floor with Jalen Waddle. Maybe the higher ceiling with Jameson Williams, just given the fact that there will be significantly more points scored in Detroit. Now, Brian Thomas will be our next receiver here. This is just a very bad offense that you have in Jacksonville, right? However, with that being said, Brian Thomas did have 9 targets this past week against the Buffalo Bills. Now, because they weren't able to move the ball down the field, this didn't amount to anything. But to be fair to Thomas and I guess Trevor Lawrence here, they've had back-to-back matchups against very tough defenses to play, such as the Cleveland Browns and the Buffalo Bills. I do stand by. I think that Brian Thomas is going to be the wide receiver 1 for me over Christian Kirk so far in this offense. We've actually seen them have the same amount of targets through the first 3 weeks. I'm going to assume that the rookie continues to improve. And at the same time, if you have no Evan Ingram, you should have more targets funneled to both of these receivers. Now, going over to the next guy, we are going to look at Khalil Shakir. Shakir has been awesome. Shakir so far this year has had double-digit points every single week, is averaging about 16 points per game, actually closer to about 15 points per game right now. Going up against the Baltimore Ravens is a spot where we could potentially have a ton of pass attempts for Josh Allen. But with all this being said, you have had a total of 14 targets for Khalil Shakir through the first 3 weeks. So yes, he's attached to one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. The volume's not particularly there. Very similar to what we have with Xavier Worthy, right? Where if we're looking at Xavier Worthy, he's attached to one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. So you're going to see some of those spike weeks like you get the 20-point week 1. But right now he's sitting with a total of 11 targets so far this season. So definitely not somebody that we can trust just yet. Zach Charbonnet will be our next guy here. If you are looking at Charbonnet, clearly, if Kenneth Walker were to play, he will be a must-start option. He will have everything in this backfield. Just like we said in week 2, just like we said in week 3, he is a must-start name if you have no Kenneth Walker. I think everybody's on board with that now. In terms of if Kenneth Walker does play, Charbonnet is probably a running back that is in a tough matchup, and he's second fiddle at best, so I am not super excited. I'm going over to Michael Pittman Jr. It's been a train wreck. The volume's been there in terms of the targets, but if you're looking at the actual receiving yards, you have 31, 21, 36. It's a really tough matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Josh Downs actually came in, and Downs had a decent little target share here this past week. Now, going over to Braylon Allen, honestly, I think I kind of want to move Braylon Allen below this. Like, if I was submitting a starting lineup, I would start Shaheed over Braylon Allen. But, I mean, Allen, obviously, back-to-back weeks now, he has looked phenomenal. He's looked like one of the most talented running backs in the league. Obviously, as a premium handcuff back, that is. And if you were to get an injury to Breece Hall, Braylon Allen immediately turns into a top 10 name. He's like a desperation play if you really need somebody. I would say Shaheed's a desperation play if you really need someone as well. He's had 14 targets this year. Doesn't have the same quarterback play as Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, such as Shakir and Worthy, of course. Courtland Sutton actually has a ton of volume. I mean, Courtland Sutton sitting here so far with 27 targets, averaging 9 targets a game through the first 3 weeks. At the same time, he's averaging fewer than 10 fantasy points per game because it's one of the worst offenses in the NFL. Looking at Yoshi Vosh, I mean, he's been great. He's had 3 touchdowns this year, but he's also had 3 touchdowns off of 17 targets, right? So unless you expect him to be at the very top of the NFL with his touchdown rate going into the future, he's probably going to be coming down. And then with Keon Coleman, Keon looks good. I mean, he was benched this past week for the opening quarter because he showed up to something late, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, he still comes away with the touchdown off of limited work. I mean, with only 31% of the snaps. But you go back to week 2, he played 91% of the snaps. So honestly, I still think if you're looking at week 1, week 2, where he played the most snaps and he ran the most routes in Buffalo, long term, he is definitely the wide receiver 1 here. But maybe you have to be worried about these disciplinary actions with the rookie. But I think that's all I got for you. Really hope that we are able to help you out with this. Of course, I'll be live streaming every single night. If you want to ask me a question, you can do so through flockfantasy.com. Check out my rankings consistently through flockfantasy.com. And if you want to get a free team review through the site, the easiest way to do that is take advantage of the offer that we have with Underdog Fantasy. You can find that link in the description in the comment section. If you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog Fantasy, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Also, promo code FLOCK on Underdog will get you hooked up with that free Patrick Mahomes pick, more than less than half total yard. You'll get that free Lamar Jackson pick on Sunday, more than less than half a total yard. And on top of that, you're going to be getting that free team review on flockfantasy.com. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address. That way I know who to credit with that free team review. But thank you again. I really do appreciate you. I really hope you have a great day, and really hope I get to check out your team in the live stream later tonight.